Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to be talking about a continuum of library publishing, a continuum of... Derek, will you put the slides up, please? We're going to be talking about a continuum of library publishing, first time musical score publication to establishing a musical label. And before we introduce ourselves, just a note, we aim for the presentation to be accessible for all people who appreciate music. This enterprise of publishing music has some significant differences in comparison to journal and monograph publishing. We realize that music may not be familiar to many of you, so please, when you have questions, add them to the chat. And knowing about some of these differences may be helpful to publishers who do not currently work in music publishing. So next slide, please. Here's a quick overview. After introductions, we will dive into some themes, history, and issues in publishing. We will then share 2 case studies from projects that launched within the last month. Both are created for or by students. The first is from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and Virginia Tech team, featuring original etudes for the developing conductor. This is a printed and audio collection of 25 etudes intended for use in instructing intermediate and advanced conducting students within the context of formal instruction at the college or graduate school level. The other is from Johns Hopkins University, titled Peabody Premieres. Peabody Premieres is a recording label that is brand new. It's a library-run recording label that features student performers, and is hosted on Bandcamp. Finally, we're planning to leave about 10 minutes at the end to discuss and explore futures in music publishing and entertain your questions. We will be monitoring the chat and dropping in links from time to time, as well as showing some QR codes that are available to you during the presentation. So please keep your QR code reader handy. Make sure you're displaying the chat, and we'd love to see your questions throughout. We will likely take those at the end, but if there's something that needs clarification, please do not hesitate to add to the chat. Next slide, please. So my name is Anita Walz. I am the Assistant Director for Open Education and Scholarly Communication Librarian at Virginia Tech.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kindred. I do graphic design and OER work for the university libraries at Virginia Tech, and I was responsible for the design and layout for one of the publications you'll hear about in a minute.
John Caldwell, UNC Greensboro. I'm the director of bands here and worked on the conducting etude book as a subject matter expert.
Shapiro from Virginia Tech, also director of bands and subject matter expert.
Hi, I'm Kathleen DeLaurenti. I'm the director of the Arthur Friedheim Library at the Peabody Institute, and I was the project manager and coordinator for the Peabody Premieres record label.
Next slide, please. So in the library publishing world, the term publishing is a lot more broadly defined than we may see in commercial environments. Much of the work we do as library publishers includes bringing technological innovation, ethics, and new business models to publishing scholarly monographs and journals in various disciplines. However, many of us are involved in pushing the boundaries of digital beyond what we could achieve in analog formats, going far beyond just putting a PDF online. A few examples include interactivity within digital books and journals, nonlinear formats such as digital humanities projects, embracing more open ways of publishing such as open access journals, open access monographs, and the emergence of a variety of openly licensed materials, also known as open educational resources or OER. We find that music has many parallels to these types of work. We also see that music publishing is similar in some ways and different than in other ways than other types of publishing. First, music and music publishing has always been at least multimodal, involving both composition and performance. Live music aside, music publishing results in written compositions and recorded music, both a different nature than journals and monographs in terms of function. You'll see a good bit of innovation in the intentional innovation in the design of both projects' outputs. Secondly, music is complex to create. There are a lot of middlemen. Music performance and recordings both require a great deal of technology and people who know how to use them. Technology in recording, in mixing sound, on the performance side, technology in engraving music, a new term for me, which means typesetting musical notation using specialized software to ensure consistency and accurate representation. Third, copyright, ownership, and licensing. Traditionally, all rights are conveyed to publishers. This is very similar in most of the scholarly world, with composers and performers receiving only a small portion of royalties. Both projects you'll hear about are concerned with musicians getting paid, but deal with rights a little bit differently than traditional norms, and actually different than each other, one with a Creative Commons license, the other through licensing. Next, while live music can be formally or informally accessed, musical artifacts such as scores and sheet music, as well as recordings, always require distribution channels. And where revenues are sought, access is ideally restricted by publishers for revenue generation purposes, though unauthorized file sharing and copying cuts into publisher and musician revenues, as we know. Distribution channels can be further complicated when working in institutional contexts. And finally, economics. The ability of composers and musicians to perform or have their work published and to receive compensation for their work is important. Music publishing, composers, and performers may face somewhat different economics than other types of creators, as external funding for the arts has always been somewhat of a challenge. We think you'll see these themes throughout our examples and our presentations. Kathleen is going to tell us now a little bit more about existing library publishing and open educational resources for music. So next, yeah.
The mute button, still an enemy in 2023. So one thing that I just want to underscore in our talk today, and Anita alluded to this a little bit, is that one of our projects is OER, the other one is not, but kind of ends up being anyway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. When you look at what's out there in the library publishing landscape, and I'm talking about things that are not music scholarly monographs that library publishers may have worked with, and the OER space there's a million choices for introductory music theory. There's some music appreciation creeping into that space, but since music classes are often outside of the large enrollment space, which is honestly by design in music from a pedagogical perspective, it's left music a little bit in the cold when we look at OER support and open projects. There's a few things out there that have popped up on the performance side, and I want to highlight the Public Domain Song Anthology because I think I saw Dave Gamadi in that audience, and he was a huge help and collaborator with that project. So we hope you will check that out. The Contemporary Music Score Collection at UCLA is a significant open access collection of music scores, but there's very little in the media space. And I have some suspicions about why, but Capital City Records was the only extant label I could find looking at this. And they're housed, which is not unusual, in a public library. But we've seen a lot of labels kind of rise and fall, not so much in libraries, but often in music departments. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that tends to happen in my project later. Next slide, please. So I've been talking about this for a little bit, and my ideas are still kind of getting shaped. Maybe I'll write about it someday. But when we think about access to music, and we think about this in the context of open access publishing, which a lot of us are focused on, in some ways we're already there with music, right? Everything's in this freemium mode. If you want to listen to almost anything in the history of recorded sound, and it really is almost anything. I mean, librarians love to say it's not all out there, but there's very little that's not out there for you to listen to for free if you want to these days. And I'm starting to see this being held up as like an exemplar of where we should be going in other complicated content spaces. But I think that it's really important to remember how these licenses came about and the ways that they function. You know, our first blanket licensing in the US was around music publishing rights over the radio. And those licensing schemes were put in place, yeah, sure, to make sure that songwriters got paid, but also very much to support publishers and radio stations, sorry, excuse me, more than anyone else, right? This is what we're seeing here in a lot of this licensing. And the way that licensing has evolved over time is that things have gotten so dilute. We've even seen in the MMA that now you can, through a letter of intent, get royalties directed straight to a producer for a record as a creator, that we're seeing performers and songwriters get less and less of a share of royalties all the time with every new scheme. And I think that this is something that's really important to think about in this space. Yes, these licenses are great because they make it so that we all can interact with this content in a free legal way that does benefit creators. But if you can go to the next slide, please, John. Actually, Derek's writing the slides, right? You can see where we are in this space, right? So this is for music publishing, which goes to the publishers and the songwriters. For the major platforms to earn minimum wage in the US, you have to have 77,474 streams, I believe, in a month. Yes, monthly minimum wage. On Napster, believe it or not, Napster pays the highest per stream rate of any streaming platform. I also need to clarify that these are approximate. We don't really know exactly what they are. And while an individual creator who retains their publishing rights is going to get more of that income from those streams, they're still never going to be able to negotiate the rate that Taylor Swift and Beyonce can negotiate. So even though Taylor Swift and Beyonce are getting like 16 cents on a dollar out of streaming income versus an independent creators, I think it's like 64 cents on the dollar, they're getting a lot more dollars. And when you look at scale and you look at the way that these platforms are set up to privilege these large company and label represented artists, you can see that it's still a really, we're not talking about anything near the level playing field that technology promised us. And that's not the technology's fault, but we can do better and we have to. Next slide. Anita.
So in a brief, thank you, Kathleen. The economics are really complicated, as you can see. So these two case studies we're about to talk about address the changing economics of music publishing. They're also designed to amplify diverse voices, and both of them focus on student learning, but in different ways. So our first case study, next slide, please, is original etudes for the developing conductor. Derek and John, please go ahead.
Yeah, so this is a conducting textbook. And so for those of you who might not be familiar with what a conducting textbook actually entails, this book, most conducting textbooks have scores that the conductor conducts from. They also have parts that the members of the class play from while someone else conducts, and it also has to function as a textbook. So some of the challenges that we had to tackle with this were creating a book that could function in all three capacities, as a set of, or as a score and sets of parts, and also as a text itself. And as you might imagine, and this is not unique to music, but most traditional conducting textbooks only contain music from deceased cisgender white men of European descent. And there are any number of reasons for that curation. Some of those are copyright issues. Some of them are familiarity with music, tradition, or other historical inequities. So to address these and some of the other issues just identified by our colleagues, Derek and I developed an idea for a book of supplemental etudes that could be used in undergraduate and graduate conducting classes. We designed the book so it could be used in any conducting classroom, regardless of pedagogical approach, and we commissioned 24 living composers to compose original etudes based on topics that we assigned them. The goal was to create a resource that was easy to use, free, and relevant for contemporary teachers and students. To fund the project, we received 2 grants, a collaborative research grant from the University Libraries at Virginia Tech, and a textbook affordability program grant from the University Libraries at UNC Greensboro. We also received additional funding, technical and publishing support from the Open Education Initiative of the University Libraries at Virginia Tech, which included Kindred and Anita being part of this, this project. So, and some of the issues that the book addresses in some way are up on the screen. Issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, access, and in particular, open access, incorporating living composers into conducting pedagogy, which is a fairly unique approach to conducting pedagogy, creating a book that was usable and navigable in PDF and also in print form, figuring out the infrastructure of a music textbook, hosting video, linking within the document, and other design aspects that Kindred will discuss later, demonstrating the viability of OER for musicians, as Kathleen already alluded to. Open resources aren't as common beyond textbooks that are used in classrooms that seat large numbers of students. And also the changing economics of publishing, as has been alluded to already. For us, there was also a component of the high cost of textbooks. You know, a conducting textbook is a relatively cheap textbook, but those prices start to add up for students. And so how do we make sure that we're helping and to address that issue as well? You can go to the next slide, Derek. So like a lot of other musical disciplines, conducting pedagogy depends basically on who you studied with. It tends to be very specific with a lot of terminology that's unique to a particular teacher. And so the challenge for the 2 of us was to create a book that could apply to anyone teaching conducting. And so what Derek and I decided on was essentially just focusing on musical elements that need to be included in the composer's etudes, and some other miscellaneous pedagogical goals. So we decided on meter or time signatures, how the music is actually organized from a time standpoint, style, so legato or marcato music, and then tempo, just rate of the speed itself. And there are some miscellaneous things, you know, cueing someone to come in or how to navigate a fermata, issues like that, changing the tempo are things that we also included in the topics that we asked the composers to address. You can go to the next one. Yeah. So each composer was given meter, tempo, style, and pedagogical goals that they had to include in their etude. And as Derek will talk about later, they all inevitably included more than just those few goals in their etude. We asked them to compose in a 4-voice format so that it could be used in any classroom. So soprano, alto, tenor, bass. The book is designed to be used in instrumental classrooms. So those soprano, alto, tenor, bass refer to the just general range of the instruments, not the voice types themselves. Each composer submitted their etude in 2 formats. There are 3 primary music notation softwares that people are using, and those file types are given there. MuseX is for finale, Sib is for Sibelius, and then Dorico is the Dorico software. And each composer also submitted in PDF, because if our engraver didn't have the software that they were using, he actually had to retype out all of their etudes from the PDF. We also asked each composer to submit a brief biography, a description of their etude, and then a link to their personal website. And then I already mentioned our engraver finalized the etude for publication, created transposed parts, and extracted a MIDI recording. And so some of the problems that we encountered over the course of the project, and Kindred is going to discuss about in a second, is you know, how to commission composers for an open access project was a unique one. I don't think there's a single composer who we worked with who had worked on an open access project. So there are questions about, you know, simply what is open access? And we've received some pushback from some composers about that, because the model traditionally for composers is they compose a piece and then they sell it and then they receive payment in that way. And so part of this was paying composers up front, which was a different model. Integrating YouTube into a publishing project, how to create the YouTube channel, how to make it integral with the book itself. As Kindred will talk about in a second, publishing using so many different kinds of software. If there's 3 different kinds of music notation softwares, how do you integrate all of those into one cohesive document? And then addressing the misperception of the value of open access as something, again, that Kathleen already spoke about. Beyond sort of music theory and music appreciation textbooks, how do we demonstrate the viability of open access within music? So Kindred's going to go through some of the design that she did so brilliantly as part of the project.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so we spent a lot of time in our first few meetings talking about what elements were important to have in the final book. And we talked about these things way before involving any of the composers or engraver that we used. So on the left here, you'll see a list of things that we thought were necessary to have in the final publication. First, we wanted students to be able to move around the document easily and also get back to the full digital text in case they printed off one individual page or exported one individual page from the PDF. It was also important that we included somehow an audio realization so that students could listen to it. And because one of the main decisions to produce this book was to include more diverse voices, we wanted to showcase composer diversity more obviously. And lastly, it was important to offer formats of the book that were accessible to a broad range of users that use the book in many different formats. So we quickly realized there was no available software to meet all of our needs, and our solution was to create our own layout from scratch, just starting out with a blank 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. One of our needs was showcasing the modern day composers that were featured in the book. We solved this by allowing each composer to submit about 150 words about themselves and their background. So the image on the left here is an example of what their biography would look like in the book. And another way we honored composers' diversity was by including in-color images of them, both on their bio page and in the footer, which is what you see here on the right. Next slide, please. Another thing that was super important was a way for students to listen to the piece of music. A lot of times this can be difficult in print publications without typing out the full URL. So to solve that, we decided to use QR codes that would work both in the digital version and the print version. Also in the digital version, we hyperlinked to YouTube so that students could choose to scan or click the link, whatever worked best for them at the time. We created a YouTube channel that hosts all 25 compositions, and the picture on the right is what our YouTube channel looks like, if you're interested. Navigation took the most time to figure out how to solve. We tried many different layouts and landed on having a footer at the bottom of every page that included all the different elements we needed. One of which is the DOI that is written out at the bottom of every page, and you can see it in 2 different formats here. That way students could get back to the full digital text whenever they needed to. And we also hyperlinked to the composer website, to YouTube again, and to different sections within the book, such as the table of contents. So with these footers on every page, you can get anywhere you need to be in the book within 2 clicks or less. For accessibility, everything is tagged structurally in the PDF. The print version offers QR codes, and there's an alternative text for all of the images in the book. Something we learned a little too late in the production phase was that alternative text for the actual music is the best way for blind or low vision users to learn the material. So we plan to write alt text for all of the music this summer and update our PDFs shortly after. Next slide, please. After we determined the different pieces of the book we needed for diversity, audio, navigation, and accessibility, we came up with a layout that included fonts and spacing and margins, all of those good things, and gave that information to the composers. So the composers submitted their music, we handed it off to our engraver, and we also gave the engraver all of those specifications. So he delivered PDFs, I added the footers and link information, and then started piecing together all of the pages to create the final 700+ page document. So Derek will walk you through what the final book looks like and how it functions.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to take you through the actual use of the text. And what you're looking at is the scores and parts version. It comes in a bunch of different versions. You can get the scores and parts, or you can just get the scores. If you get the scores and parts, it is 781 pages for reasons I'll show you. So one of the great things about navigating this book is scrolling 781 pages makes things very challenging. So, for example, when you go to the table of contents, every single thing that you see is going to be linked, which is really convenient. And I'm seeing in my ensemble class as well as my conducting class, I would say just over half of students at the beginning of the year had some sort of electronic access device. And then that would improve, or that would go up as we went through the school year. And students are increasingly using tablets, iPads, convertible laptops to access these materials. So we tried to create something that could work well on electronically and on paper. And we wanted to make sure that we were covering the flow of an actual conducting class, which can be fast and furious depending on how many students are in the class. So, for instance, if we were to take a musical example, let's say this piece by Susan Boddy, who's an awesome singer and composer, we can go straight to the piece. And for every piece that we include, it's going to have a background bio of the composer along with their website and any online materials that they have, because it's really important that students are able to learn about the composer because it helps them better understand their music. And it gives the composer a little bit more, it gives them the ability to be seen by people that may not have seen their music before. They're also able, in their own words, to talk about the excerpt the etude that they wrote, which we think is very important because it's a primary resource. So when you're getting it straight from the mouth of the composer, that's something that you can really work with. Also is the length of the etude, the approximate length, the commission parameters. So these are the things that we outlined in the original communication. These are the things we're looking for in it. And then John and I went through and we selected all the additional pedagogical opportunities that happen to appear after they wrote the work, which helps teachers of conducting plan ahead. So if what comes right after that is the score, and the score is all 4 parts going all the way through to the end. And one of the great things about this is when you get to, this is actually one of the longest excerpts that we have. We have some that are as short as 20-something seconds, which is literally 1 page long. But if you want to if you get to the end, and at any point, if you want to go back to the top of the score, you can just click that, and you're back at the top of the score. Now, if you're like me, and so I'm a saxophone player, at least I once was before I was a conductor, I play E-flat alto saxophone. So conducting class makes up 2 different parts. Either you're playing in the ensemble or you're conducting that ensemble that's being played by students. So if I'm a saxophone player, you can access any of these parts at the bottom right. So alto saxophone is in E-flat. I click that, and I'm instantly to the part that I have to play for the person that is conducting me. And let's say that I'm next and I've played the part and I need to go back to the score. You instantly click and you're back to the score and you're ready to jump up in front of everyone and conduct. And it's pretty fantastic. As you can see, we've also linked to the composer's website at the bottom, as well as give it in the description. The last element of this particular thing is being able to listen to a MIDI rendition of the score. And so I am going to take you to our YouTube site, which is right here. And so when you click that link, it opens up our YouTube site. And this has everything in a playlist. where you can instantly hit play and see what the excerpt sounds like. And as you can see, it has page turns and everything. Still sounds like a MIDI representation, but at least students have audio examples of every single excerpt in there. And this is what the front page of our YouTube site looks like. And I'm going to hop back into the book real quick. Give me 1 second. There we go. So what the one last thing I wanted to show is we created a pedagogical chart. So I'm going to hop back up to the table of contents. We have musical characteristics by etude. And so at the top is all of the composers in the works. And then on the left-hand side are all the pedagogical things that you might include in a conducting curriculum. So if you're looking for a slow piece that's in 4/4, all you have to do is find slow piece where the dots are, and then look under 4/4, and you can match all of these things up according to what you need in the curriculum. So we think it's pretty great. I'm not aware of something that exists that has the similar kind of thing. And it's really, we've mentioned that we've had some challenges with getting composers on board, but now that it's out, they're actually really enthusiastic about it because of everything that it does. So I'm going to turn it back over to Anita.
Great. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, John. Kathleen is going to talk with us next about Peabody premieres. Kathleen.
Thanks. Can we get the next slide, please? So Peabody Premieres is a record label that's run out of the Arthur Friedheim Library. The goal of the label is to create new interpretations of works from composers who have been historically underrepresented in the published sound recording catalog. We are managed by myself and an advisory board comprised of students and faculty. So one of the things the advisory board had to do when we set it up is say, like, what is going to be the focus content-wise, and where we landed is music that has been recorded and released and published on professional labels fewer than 3 times. So the goal with this is to make sure that musicians have the resources that they need to program this music. So the hope is that folks will hear this music, they will get to hear different interpretations of it. What does so-and-so's version sound like compared to this other person's version over here? And then make decisions to elevate this music or music from these composers in their own programming decisions. Next slide, please. How did we get here? Lear Willinger, who is graduating with a doctoral of musical arts from our piano program this May, came to me during COVID and said, Kathleen, I have copyright questions about how to start a record label. You can see here, I run a copyright education service out of our library for our students because music copyright is ugly and I love it. So we talk about this a lot. And Leor expressed to me the goals that he had with this record label. He was thinking of starting it as a student-led club. And so at the end of our conversation, I said, so Leor, like, you know, we talked about some of the challenges with investment and funding, who would do the recording, how would they raise the money for the recording itself. And I said, one thing we could think about that could create some support and longevity for this project is if we wanted to potentially do it as a collaboration. I'd been thinking about what a label would look like in the library, and I thought that this was a great project to partner with, and Leor was really enthusiastic about it. So we put together a budget and a proposal and took it forward to our executive board, and here we are just a couple years later. Next slide, please. So what resources do you need to start a label? Things that not every university or library might have around that we're lucky enough to have. Conservatory level performers, studio space and recording spaces, and a professional recording engineering program. So these three pillars were really the basis of what we had available at Peabody that allowed us to think through this. But we still had to have some conversations about what this looked like. So my first call before I even took this to our executive leadership was to the chair of our recording arts division and saying, hey, are you interested in this? Does your department have the capacity to do this? What resources do I need to ask for to make sure that this is something that's sustainable? I had this great idea, right? It's 2023, things are so easy. We can release 2 full records a year. It's going to be fantastic. But Scott Metcalf, my colleague, kind of slowed me down very quickly. And it made me realize that, especially, we're talking with students who may never have been in a recording situation before, every 15 minutes of music is about 4 hours in the studio. So we used that as a benchmark for setting what we thought we would be capable of doing. I'll talk a little bit more about some other red tape and challenges. But the one other thing that we did have to make this successful, if we can go to the next slide, is money. I'm going to be completely blunt about this. So we've been talking about economic realities right now. And the economic reality is that the idea that you can generate significant revenue from accessing copies of stuff in 2023 is frankly silly. So we knew right away that we were not going to position this as a revenue generator for the Institute. And this is something Hopkins is actually generally very keen on, what's going to be the revenue aspect of this project or any project. But when we put the proposal together and took it to leadership, we said, hey, this is how much it's going to cost, but we only think we're going to be able to generate this much income. It's going to be a loss leader. We think that this is worth doing because of the content that we want to elevate. We wanted to make space for more diverse creative voices, both on the stage and in our published recording collections. So we felt like that was really worthwhile. And that's something that Peabody's really invested in right now. So the dean and some of the other leadership were very keen on the mission. And we actually were commended right out of the gate for coming at this and saying that we did not think it was going to make money. Folks in the room had experience with other labels at other universities, generally in the School of Music, and they had always shut down because they had been positioned based on what happened in the 90s and that very brief history of recorded music as something that was going to be a big revenue generator for the department. And when that didn't happen, they generally have shut down. So that's kind of where we were. We were like, just like OER, even though we're not going to do this as quite an OER, but we already talked about how recorded music is kind of open anyway. That's really where we structured the function of the label around the mission of what we're doing. Next slide, please. Sustainability. So I said that we had to have realistic budgeting, but that also meant that we needed to really advocate for and try to come up with a way to make sense of how we were going to compensate folks. So we knew that we had two challenges, that even Peabody has some limited resources, but we also know that, I'm like the staff for the label, me. I'm also running a huge conservatory library and doing a few other things. So we knew right away that we had to have a model that from a reporting perspective and a data management perspective and a compensation perspective was going to work based on the staff and resources that we had. So we've come up with a model really sort of influenced by the OER mode where we're compensating everyone up front. Most classical labels operate this way anyway, until you get all the way up to like the top of Sony Classical and you're Larry Brownlee, who's one of the most famous tenors in the world today. You are working in a situation where they're going to pay you a stipend. You may also have to come up with some costs for things like the recording and everything else on your own. But then the label's going to own that recording. So we've looked at that model. We've said, hey, library ownership of this recording is going to make things a lot easier, but how can we balance this in a fair way? So we have the advisory board came up with a stipend schedule depending on how many musicians were involved in a project. Every musician gets a copy of this recording to use in their portfolios, to use to highlight their work and their playing in ways that they might need to with portfolios, competition submissions, and things like that. So they leave with a professional studio recording that they may not otherwise be able to afford to have done. And then on the composer side, we're also trying to do compensation up front for the first recording. For folks who aren't familiar, the compulsory system doesn't kick in for recordings of music if it's never been recorded before. So there has to be a first recording, and for many things in our first release, they had never been recorded before. They were at that 0 place, and they were all from living composers. Some of those composers had this work represented by their publishers, some of them did not. I can say surprisingly that those who had publishers managing this went right to statutory rates and a contract with us that they had that were less than the formulas that we came up with to compensate folks for that first recording fee. And we also have a formula that doubles what we understand as the base royalty rates for that first year as well for direct downloads and streaming. So, we've tried to really come up with something that we think is advantageous to everyone involved, and also will help us think about how we can do something that's sustainable. We needed to match our, we also wanted to keep the mission centered and match our resources to our goals, right? Not, my eyes were bigger than my stomach at first. We've pulled back on this. It takes about 18 months now in our schedule to get releases out. So we finished mastering our second set of releases this semester. We're hoping to have those released next February, and we just closed applications for our third round submissions. Next slide. Challenges and opportunities. Challenges, getting people to sign on the dotted line. I have 2 pieces that did not get released to the public on the record album, but are in our archives because the composers just haven't signed the contracts yet. When you're running your own business and you're living that hustle life, it can be difficult to sometimes dot the I's and cross the T's. So I'm working really hard to try to make that happen and get those released. Other challenges, I think, are really like university specific. I don't know if any of you have tried to convince your university to let you set up a PayPal account that can charge people things, but that was a fun exercise, but I did it. It can be done, friends. State institutions may have different kinds of unique challenges, but I managed to make my way through the private institution red tape there. The other thing was getting someone to anoint me with the power to sign, click the button on Bandcamp, right? Someone had to say, I accept the terms for the university. So I had to get permission, and that took like 7 meetings and figuring out who needed to be in the room. And like OGC was like, yeah, Kathleen, this looks fine. We don't have any concerns. And then I was like, well, can I do this? And like, we don't know. So who do I have to ask for permission? So that was a really interesting, long process to get through, but we are there. Next slide, please. Future plans. So we are not on the aggregator services yet. We are currently only on Bandcamp. I'm happy to dig into the licensing complexities with anybody who wants to geek out with me about this. But basically, to have your music distributed on Spotify, Apple Classical now, Amazon Music, YouTube, you need to work with an aggregator service if you are not a major label. These services will not work directly with independent artists. So I have to go through another round of getting someone to allow me to check the button, and that has not quite happened yet. I kind of wanted to see what would happen with our first releases on Bandcamp only too. And I also need to advocate for an assistant who's going to help me out with this, because it's going to be a fun time. We also need a marketing plan, which might sound silly, but to this point, we're not really interested in trying to just maximize sales. So we're really looking at this as a lab and a student experience process. So I'm also really thinking about how we open this up for our students down the road, but I also think that it would be valuable for a student assistant to think through and start to build a marketing plan. We have an entrepreneurial musician curriculum at Peabody, and we're trying to really align closely with that. And I'm working with the chair of that department to see what's the best way to now use the label now that we're live with those students. Next slide, please. So I hope you will check it out. We are here, and I'm going to ask Derek to play a sample from one of our first releases so you can hear it. We're very proud. Sure.
I shall make a song like your hair.
So that was mezzo-soprano Taylor Boykins with pianist Leor Willinger, our label founder, singing The Secret by B.E. Boykin, who was a delight to work with. I cannot recommend her enough. But I hope that you will come and you will consider buying a track or two. And I also wanted to just share, interestingly, one of the fun challenges of this particular recording. We were still in a little bit of transition space with Hopkins Public Health information with COVID, and our singers had been told to go back into masks. And we have two projects that were by singers with pianists. So we were in a situation where we had to, in January of 2022, think on our feet about how we were going to make this happen. And luckily, we had just had some internal funding on some low latency technology. And so we had our singers in a studio by themselves singing, so everyone was safe. And then we had the pianists in a room down the hall, but actually it was another building, connected through low latency television, so they could see each other on the screen, hear the sound recording engineer, producer, who were in a whole nother room, and make it work. And so to me, to hear these recordings today is kind of incredible, knowing the conditions under which they were actually made. And it's super exciting because we're here and we're live, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to share everybody's hard work on this. The producer in that session came to me right afterwards and said, Taylor Boykins is the next Audra McDonald. So you heard it here first, everyone. And I hope you will support her work online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Thank you so much, all of you. Derek, Jonathan, Kindred, there's so much learning that is going on in this space. It's pretty obvious from your stories and the things that you have worked through to develop these resources, that there's a great deal of learning. So we really want to see audience questions, but we know it takes a little bit to type them out. So please write your questions in the chat. We'd love to respond to them. But in the meantime, a question for our panelists. Based on your experience with these projects, and I think I'll address this to John, what do you see as the possibilities for music publishing?
Well, I'll say first that commercial music publishing has been really frustrating to work with recently. And Kathleen, we spoke about this in, I think, our first meeting. There's one major US publisher right now for commercial printed music. It's basically just Alfred. And everything else is small publishers. It's really difficult to get stuff out there. And so I'm hoping that the future, and I'm hoping that the book demonstrates the viability of this open model for doing something that is that's of high quality, that's been peer reviewed, that can really push things forward. Because I mean, and the reason that the theory and music appreciation textbooks are open access is because so many people will use them. The reason that a contemporary, a traditional publisher publishes a piece of music is because they'll sell a lot of copies. Our conducting textbook has been downloaded a lot, but it's never going to reach the amount of volume that some of those other resources do. So demonstrating the viability of this and demonstrating that this book's almost kind of a proof of concept for this going forward. I hope that that's what comes out of this.
Great, thank you.
Would
you like to? Please.
I was going to just add some thoughts on there. Another problem that we face right now with music publishing is that, especially as we're moving more into a digital space, libraries are not customers that these publishers see as someone that they need to work with. So the Music Library Association and a committee I'm on have put out like some model language for licenses if you want to purchase scores with a license that allows you to do the things that you need to do with them as a library, right? We don't have for sale for digital materials. Composers like John and Derek or the folks that they're working with don't want to have to necessarily find a printer. I've talked to so many composers who are just giving stuff away because working with publishers is frustrating, or they can't find a publisher that they want to work with that's going to espouse their values. Raven Chacon, who is the most recent Pulitzer Prize winner in music, only has one book of any published scores of any of his material. So we're in a space where if we want to if we want to have collections that represent more diverse creative voices, we need to think about how we're going to do this as libraries. I'm hoping that we'll be able to socialize this license for young composers too, so that if they want to retain control of this in their lives and have it all available online and do this online, that they understand that there's special things they need to do with librarians, and hopefully give them a way to make this as frictionless for them as possible. So we don't have emails from our acquisitions teams just sitting out there. Or I talk to music librarians all the time who aren't like me, who's lucky enough to have an acquisitions person, and they're like, my acquisition staff just won't do it. They say it's too hard. And this makes me think a lot about how we're framing sustainability in libraries these days, and how, you know, sustainability sounds in many cases like a positive word, and I often see it used to enact really negative and sometimes questionably ethical decisions. I'm seeing this come up a lot in open monograph conversations, like we need to move towards a big deal because projects like Tome are unsustainable because of the funding and the staff time that goes into them. But my next question is, what are we going to do then to ensure that we're not just reinforcing the same problems that we've seen in traditional publishing, and whose voices get heard and whose voices get elevated in these spaces? And I think that we need to really think about this. And so I'm a real proponent, especially in music, of educating from doing grassroots education with our creators now, so that they know what choices they're making. They can be informed about how they're managing their careers, and they can look for partners like Anita or myself who are willing to work with them on different kinds of models that will ensure that they're fairly compensated, but also ensure that we're really thinking about how we're contributing to what collections we can have in our organizations, right?
So a little bit of conversation in the chat, similar to the word scalable, how it sometimes is used to say, you know, it's too hard. John, Derek, Kindred, do you feel like it's too hard? I know Kindred carried the bulk of the production work. I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's hard. There's a lot of work to do. This is not something that is easy production wise. There are other challenges. Thoughts you want to add, John, Derek, or Kindred?
Go ahead, Kindred.
It just takes time and money, and without anything to go off of, like, you kind of just have to create it yourself and spend a lot of time failing and trying again. Yeah, so it would be nice to have more people try, so that other people have models and can work off of each other.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
Yep.
So one question that came up as we talked together as a group over the few months, Kathleen did consult with us very early on, as well as more recently when we had questions and said, we've never done this before. How did you do this? What do you know about this? One of the questions that has come up is whether or not this is a viable model outside of the academy. Is this possible to do either in or for with people outside of higher education, outside of the academy? I'd love to hear your thoughts, any of you, on that. Derek, you look like you're unmuted, but I don't know if that means that you want to talk or not.
Well, I mean, you know, we applied for a grant, we got it, right? And so we're with the specific idea of doing this. And the typical model, so we're speaking from the college university band stance. The typical model for a commission would be somebody is the lead commissioner, and they go after a composer and they say, hey, we'd love you to write a piece, and we'll do we'll get a group together and everyone will pay enter amount here, anywhere from $250 to $500 a school. And the lead commissioner gets the first performance. And then after that, the people that have contributed money get the piece, and then they get first dibs in the first 6 months. It's closed to just the commissioners. So I again, talking about how I think maybe the viability of the Virginia Tech publishing thing behind it kind of helped its case. There were a lot of composers that had a lot of questions and didn't really know about it. And so I'd be really curious how and what other forms of music publishing this could take in the future.
So one of the things I'm really interested, I was the first open access editor for the Music Library Association. I'm still on the editorial board. And I'm planning to continue this conversation with John after these proposals. Is what we can think of from a subscribe to open kind of model and how that might work with certain kinds of music publishing. I think especially on the composition side, I see two extremes now in action. People hyper controlling music, especially large ensemble music. It can only be put out for rental only. No one can own a copy, which means no one can study the music. It creates all kinds of barriers to access. And on the flip side, people like I said earlier, just giving it away because the whole process of dealing with the publishing or self-publishing is just so problematic. So I'm wondering if this is maybe a middle ground that might be able to compensate our composers more fairly, and thinking about our institutional subscriptions to these content. Like how can we do this in a way that that will require investment from libraries for sure, but what does that investment look like, and how do we become early in my career there was this idea like we shouldn't have to always pay for PPR with films, right? Because we're not here to support the film industry. But I think my thinking on that has changed a lot, and I think if we want to see these kinds of voices in our collections, we have to proactively think about what we can do to make that happen.